You want a build that clears quickly, that can do bosses, Ubers included, and is something you can play from day 1 of a league all the way to day 90. If so, that build is Wave of Conviction Ignite Elementalist. And I'm sure if you're somewhat familiar with Elementalist builds or Ignite builds, you now have a couple of questions, like why not just play EK or why not just play Hex Blast? Well, I originally tried Hex Blast, and I found the skill's targeting to be very annoying. For more on that, you can check out the video in the card later, but the TLDR is, I didn't like how it played. The damage was great, and it felt bad, so I swapped back to Wave of Conviction. But then, what about EK? Well, if you're just looking to clear, EK isn't a bad choice. It has plenty of damage and a ton of clear speed, especially since not only are you a projectile skill that fires in every direction, but you also have things like Chain and Ignite Prolif. However, it also tends to be a bit squishier, and it requires more gear to get going, something that I wasn't going to have from day 1 of a league. So I decided ultimately to stick with Wave of Conviction Ignite, because my build does everything that I want it to. I don't really feel any pressure to switch to EK, Hex Blast, or anything else. If you want to know more about how I leveled the build, check out the VOD of my entire leveling livestream, which will be in the card right now. Now, before I get into the rest of the gear, there's a few really important mechanics that I want to highlight. If you get these things wrong, the build might feel bad to play, or it might just be unplayable. The first of which is Spell Suppression and Elevor. Spell Suppression is one of the best layers of mitigation that this build has access to. Most bosses in Path of Exile primarily use spells, so this basically says take 50% less damage from bosses. Elevor takes it to another level, because now not only do you take 50% less damage from bosses, but when you're mapping, and when a lot of weaker enemies are hitting you, you'll heal for I'd say 150 to 200 life per spell you suppress. The roll is a little larger, but you really don't want to go below that 150 mark. This way, not only are the small hits completely erased, but in fact they could heal you, and keep you alive through some attacks you're taking as well. For more details on how Elevor works, check out the video linked in the card. This will be up at the top right. And to stick with the theme of erasing the damage you take, this build also block caps with Glancing Blows. Normally, when you block cap with Glancing Blows, quite a bit of damage pierces your block. However, with a life gain on Block Shield, while the damage does still pierce, it's going to pretty much get absorbed entirely by the shield and the Elevor. If you can't find a shield like mine, don't worry, you can always just use an Aegis Aurora. It'll mean that you have to go Mind Over Matter, but that's easy enough to accomplish via an invocation on your Sanctified Relic, and overall will have a very similar effect. The next important defensive mechanic is Primal Aegis. This is the build's primary defense against elemental damage, especially elemental attack damage. It's kind of rough these days to just run 75% all res. A lot of things hit really hard, and even if you're overcapped on your resists, you'll feel vulnerable at times. This is especially true if you ever fight any Uber bosses, something that I have done on this build. But Primal Aegis extends our health from around 5,000 to close to 7,500, which really does go a long way when taking those big hits from Uber bosses. It doesn't mean you can't get one-shot if you add a ton of mods to your Eater of Worlds and then stand in everything, but it does mean that you won't be one-shot too often, and if you are, you'll know it's your fault. Though in mapping, one-shots are much less of a concern, because we also use the Progenesis Flask. This is one of the most amazing defensive items in the game currently, and when combined with a little bit of recoup or regen, it completely erases 25% of the damage that you take. This not only extends your health pool and protects you against one-shots, but it's incredibly powerful when combined with all of our unblocked recovery, since if we take a bunch of little hits, we'll heal from the damage, and this blocks the big ones in between. For more about that, check the video in the card in the top right. And finally, the last mechanic that I wanted to talk about is the main reason we're Elementalist as opposed to Occultist. That being Shaper of Flames. This says that all of your damage can ignite, and you deal more ignite damage so long as the highest portion of a hit is fire. This means you'll have to tinker around in PoB. Make sure you're not getting too much Fizz's Extra Cold or Fizz's Extra Chaos. But so long as the minimum roll of your fire damage outweighs the highest roll of either your Chaos or Cold damage, whatever else is highest, you'll be in a pretty good spot, and this will help you do massive damage because it means any Fizz's Extra or Elia's Extra mod contributes to your ignite. Normally, only fire damage would, which would make our damage much harder to scale. And so now that I've talked about the core mechanics, let's get into some of the items. First off, Obliteration. Remember, Fizz's extra chaos contributes to our base damage, which contributes to our ignite, so try to get as close to 40% as possible. For even more damage while mapping, a 10% chance to gain Unholy Might on kill is great and has really high uptime. The main reason we're wearing Obliteration is of course we have a 20% chance for enemies you kill to explode, dealing a quarter of your maximum life as chaos damage. Because all damage ignites, this damage ignites. And because it's a quarter of an enemy's life, this means your damage will scale with the content you're in. Essentially, Obliteration does exactly the same amount of damage if you're in a tier 1 map or a fully juiced tier 16. And having the extra explosions is great because it greatly increases our coverage and clear speed. Now, if you're in the Sanctum, or fighting a boss, Obliteration doesn't do all that much for you, so instead I suggest a scepter like this, though it can be a wand if you're on a budget. Try to get some combination of the following: +1 to Fizz spells, or lightning spells, or fire spells, because Wave of Conviction has the physical lightning and fire tags, +1 to all spell skills, increased fire damage over time multiplier, damage over time multiplier, burning damage, or physical damage as extra. Again, this can be Fizz's extra chaos, Fizz's extra fire, Fizz's extra cold, Fizz's extra lightning, or if you can find a good one, even Elia's extra chaos. All of these options will contribute to your base damage, thus the total damage that you deal. Now, for the shield, it gets tricky, because this item is really good. And by really good, I mean you probably don't want to try to copy what I have. However, there's a few ways of getting something useful. The most important stats here are the +1 to level of all lightning skill gems, recover life when you block, and spell damage. You can work around the increased reservation efficiency by just running 2 Enlighten supports, and I've left 2 sockets open on my Obliteration just to kind of simulate that. Life is of course nice, but as long as you have an empty prefix, it's not a big deal. Now, if you want a really easy solution, just slap on an Aegis Aurora. This will get you 95% of the way there. You'll just have to grab Mind Over Matter on an Invocation, and you should be good to go. That makes things much simpler, because then you don't need to worry about a rare shield at all. But if you do want that rare shield, there's 2 ways to get it. The first is a synthesized shield with recover 5% of life when you block as the implicit. The second is to buy the lightning, fizz, or fire spell skills, ideally a decent life roll and chance to block spell damage, and then slam with a Warlord Exalt. On average, it should take you about 20 tries, so this is far from a cheap or easy method, but given how insane this item is and how difficult it will be to recreate, if you want something good, that's the way you're going to have to go. On the other hand, the Elevore is super easy. Pretty much any Elevore will do, though do try to get 24 or 25% chance to suppress spell damage and as close to 200 life recovered as possible. I also grabbed this one with an increased burning damage implicit, but really any lab enchant's fine too, something like Curse Effect, Wave of Conviction damage, or Wave of Conviction Res Shred. For my chest piece, I'm using Skin of the Lords. Not only is this a great way to get Magebane that helps to cap my suppress, but +2 to level of socketed gems is a massive damage boost, further magnified by the fact that I have an Empower in here, so it goes from 4 to 6 for a +5 to level of active skill gems. Do remember to put anything in a Skin of the Lords, it has to be corrupted, so get used to volleying your items, but it is a lot of damage. In theory, a rare is probably better, but you're going to feed a lot of those to the double corruption chamber before you get what you want. If you're truly insane and use a rare, try to get +1 curse, since curses are a great way to scale the build's damage, and you can always drop Culling Strike for punishment. Next up, we have a belt. I crafted this item really early and just haven't felt the need to replace it. Spam Envy Essences, you can use the tier 2 essence to save some money. Keep going until you hit res and life and you're good to go. Having energy shield or armor is certainly a plus, as it might mean you don't have to use something like Divergent Inspiration to be able to use your Divine Blessing. The jewel's just something that I'm using for my Corrupted Blood. This is another really old item that I probably should update, but haven't. Strength and Dex is good because I need it, life is good, and the rest is damage. Though I would try to get some chance to avoid shock here if you can. And then we have the gloves, another item that I crafted myself with, if you guessed Envy Essences, you are correct. It's probably easier to make this with Rog, but I got this base as a drop, and I just happened to have some essences, so I threw them on, hit really good life, said YOLO, closed my eyes, prayed to Chris Wilson, slammed on Hybrid Life, and decided, maybe I don't need Rog after all this time. It is important to have chance to suppress spell damage. Again, the exact number will vary a little bit based on the roll on your Elevore and your Dex, but in my experience you'll want at least 6% and more likely 7 or 8. For my boots, these are another fractured base that I got. The crafting method is pretty simple. Roll with Essence of Torment until you get chance to avoid being shocked, and Tier 1 Chaos Res. Worst case, if you're on a budget, Tier 2 Chaos Res does always work. Then suffixes can't be changed, Veiled Chaos, block a prefix that's either life or mana, Unveil, hope you get move speed, you will, I believe, 5 out of 6 times. Worst case if you don't, it's another 2 Divines to try again. Now, I have a really good Sanctified Relic that gives me move speed and chance to block attack damage. If you don't have that, you'll need to do something slightly different on your boots. Get rid of a drop Scorch Ground for instead chance to avoid shock, and just swap this from 20% chance to avoid ailments to 1% chance to block attack damage per 5% block on your shield. As long as you have a decent shield, you should have 25% block, and you'll be totally good to go. Now, in terms of my rings, in the left slot I'm using Polaric Devastation. It's a large amount of damage, ailment duration feels really nice, especially against ignite-resistant enemies, and it's a defensive layer, because Ash does apply a 20% less move speed modifier, so when enemies charge at you, it's a little easier to avoid them. My other ring is kind of just the kitchen sink. It's everything that I was missing elsewhere, and decided to jam it all into one item. This caps Chaos Res, though you could easily have an Elemental Res implicit and a Chaos Res explicit. This is all the decks that I need for my gems. It's technically replaceable elsewhere. You could have it on boots, you could have it on gloves. This could just be another Tier 1 resist. Flammability or elemental weakness on hit, and of course as much life as you can get, plus either the -7 or reduced mana cost to help make everything a little more efficient. And finally, the Amulet. Again, this is a very flexible slot. Try to get the best thing you can with some of the following modifiers. Gain 15% of Fizz as either cold, fire, or lightning damage, +1 to level of all lightning, fire, or physical skill gems, or of course, if you can find it, +1 to all skill gems. And then for the suffixes, try for either damage over time multiplier or fire damage over time multiplier. If you can get life and resists, it's a plus, but you can make those things up elsewhere if you need to. Now, flask-wise, I already covered Progenesis, but I did want to touch on Taste of Hate. This is another really nice defensive layer. It helps to mitigate physical damage, and again, it helps to add physical damage because Fizz's extra can contribute to our ignites. Now in terms of jewels, I'm using a pretty basic cluster here. It's not anything all that special, though do pay attention to the medium, which has Fan the Flames, because this is how I'm getting ignite proliferation. If you don't have this, you'll either need it as a glove implicit, which is a significant damage loss, or to socket ignite prolif in your chest, which is again a significant damage loss. The Watcher's Eye is a bit of ailment steal damage faster, and defenses, ignore the consecrated ground stuff, I'm not using Zealotry. Then I'm using an Intuitive Leap, because this is really efficient to pick up some block, gain some damage, and gain some recoup. Though, ultimately, this isn't absolutely mandatory. You can get the stats elsewhere, it just means pathing over here for some spell block, and losing out on a bit of damage and recovery. The other very important jewel is Storm Shroud. If I have a 100% chance to avoid being shocked, then I have a 100% chance to avoid all elemental ailments. Because this way I don't have to worry about Brittle, I don't have to worry about Shock, and I don't have to worry about Scorch. Now, I know that was kind of a lot, but hopefully it gave you a good idea of what you're getting into if you choose to play this build. If you want a more condensed version, something that you can go back and reference, there is a POB on screen right now, which will also be in my Discord. So just take a minute, pause the video, write it down, and then move on to the next section. If you need to hop into my Discord, it's down in the description below, and while you're there, maybe leave a like on the video, and get subscribed, because I'm going to be talking about more fun stuff, including Torchlight Infinite's next season, sometime in the near future. Overall, the gameplay is very smooth. You spend most of your time flame dashing around maps, casting Wave of Conviction, and watching packs explode. The build works really well in open areas, because you can get from pack to pack and hit everything. It also works really well in enclosed areas, because the closer enemies are, the more likely they're to be hit by either the explosion from another enemy dying, or of course, your Ignite Prolif. In terms of active buffs, we are using a Divine Blessing Hatred, so you'll need to keep that up to do optimal damage. Though you won't need it most of the time, and it does require a lot of mana, which in this case, because the build is EB, means a lot of ES. If you're ever struggling with that, maybe because you don't have a belt like mine with a ton of ES on it, try Divergent Inspiration Support. With a 44% reduced mana cost, it should make it much more palatable. And the only other buff you really have to worry about is Arcanus Brand that will automatically be casting Flame Surge and Elemental Weakness. though if you use 3 curses, drop the Culling Strike support, and instead put Temp Chains, Enfeeble, or Punishment there. And I've spent quite a bit of time now talking about the build's mapping, but can it kill bosses? Absolutely yes it can. In the Sanctum, I've done plenty of runs, including the final boss, where I couldn't recover Resolve. I was blind the entire time, so I took a lot of nasty boons. I haven't done a no-hit run yet, but that's probably more on me than on the build, and also I've never dropped the Relic. And I've also taken on a wide variety of standard boss content in Path of Exile, including Uber Elder, Uber Maven, Uber Eater of Worlds, Uber Cirrus, and much more. If I really wanted to get into bossing, I'd probably want to go CI and pick up Aegis Aurora. I feel like that's just going to scale a little bit better, especially with the insane defensive or damage requirements to comfortably farm Ubers. But as someone who wasn't really looking to farm them, who just wanted to dip his toes in, do a couple fights, use a couple keys, and hopefully get some good drops, I can tell you that in that order, I did a couple of fights, I used up my keys, and I just got endless disappointment because I think the most valuable thing I got was worth around 12 chaos. But that didn't really take away from the build being super enjoyable. I've done a really wide variety of content on it. Farming Exile Atlas memories, farming Harvest Atlas memories, just speedrunning with Alcan Go, doing Expedition including Expedition logbooks, fighting the pinnacle bosses that I needed for my Voidstones, and some Uber bosses because I apparently hate myself. And even a little bit of high investment Delirious mapping. And the build was great in all of it. Sure, if I do something stupid, like put in a minus max 60% less recovery map with reduced block chance, and then click a bunch of altars uncapping my resistances and letting enemies expose me, I'm gonna die. But overall, between the block and the spell suppression, I didn't really feel like I had to play super carefully. In fact, I could be downright careless in most Alcan Go maps and never suffer the consequences of it. If you're okay with dealing with a second degen and want even more defenses, maybe consider replacing your life flask with a Forbidden Taste. You'll need to sacrifice another flask suffix to deal with bleed, but overall it could well be worth it. Though if you do, I suggest getting something like life regen on your helmet, as that degen can be a little bit nasty if you're not careful. And also, be 100% sure your chaos res is capped. One thing I really value about this build is it has very high damage consistency. Sure, there's things like Heart of Destruction and Elemental Overload, which aren't quite up 100% of the time. However, Elemental Destruction lasts for 4 seconds, and has a cooldown of 8 seconds. Our Ignite lasts for over 4 seconds, so as long as you're being pretty efficient, you'll have it up most if not all of the time. And while you won't have 100% uptime on Elemental Overload, it still should be pretty decent. Wave of Conviction has a fairly low cast time and a fairly high crit rate. Though, just to opt on the side of safety, I enabled EO and didn't enable Convergence just for calculation purposes, so you could get a rough idea about the build's damage and defenses. If you started Wave of Conviction Ignite Elementalist, then I hope this video helps you scale further into the endgame. If you're looking for a solid build to reroll to, you can start playing this at pretty much any budget. After all, I started with nothing on day 1, and here I am with, let's just go with yes for investment because I don't know how much I've spent anymore. And even if I did, prices will probably be changed by tomorrow. You'll have a build that can do all content and feels great while doing it. A build to play from day 1 to day 90. And so now I'm curious, what are some of your favorite all-league builds? Other things you've played that ended up lasting way longer than you expected, and you felt like you could keep investing, and it would just get better and better. Let me know some of those thoughts down in the comments below. And of course, before I go, a special thanks to my patrons and channel members for their continued support. For as low as $1 a month, you can help make videos just like this one possible. Now, if you're looking for something else to watch, there's several resources in the card up at the top right, or YouTube will have something on screen right now. But we're also almost at the end of the year, so I'm going to have a couple of end-of-year wrap-up videos which should be on the channel soon. If those interest you, then get subscribed, and while you're down there, don't forget to leave a like. It's completely free, and it really helps me out. But that's all I've got for today. Thanks for watching, I hope you learned something, and I hope to see you again sometime soon.